In the spring of 1940, while Europe burned under the shadow of the Luftwaffe, an American company few had heard of, North American Aviation, proposed a radical new fighter. The British Purchasing Commission, desperate for aircraft, wanted more Curtiss P-40s. But North American engineers countered, "Give us 120 days and we'll build you something better." Out of that bold promise came the NA-73X prototype, a sleek aerodynamic machine that would one day be known as the P-51 Mustang. At first, no one cared much about it. The U.S. Army Air Corps wasn't interested. They already had the P-38 Lightning and the P-47 Thunderbolt. Even the British viewed the Mustang as a stopgap, something to fill a production gap rather than a war winner. Its Allison engine limited it to low altitudes, where it performed decently, but above 15,000 feet, the realm where dogfights decided the fate of nations, it struggled. To many military planners, it was just another fighter, another entry in the endless alphabet soup of prototypes. Meanwhile, Germany's Luftwaffe roamed Europe unchallenged. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 dominated the skies. The idea that a new, untested American-built aircraft could challenge their supremacy seemed laughable. In Berlin, Luftwaffe intelligence reports barely mentioned the Mustang. A British single-seat low-altitude fighter of no particular importance, one 1942 briefing noted. That dismissive line would soon haunt them. But inside North American's California hangars, engineers led by Edgar Schmood, a meticulous designer born in Germany himself, were quietly creating something revolutionary. The Mustang's laminar flow wing, a first in mass-produced fighters, reduced drag dramatically. Its range was already longer than most, and its frame was robust yet light. It was a machine waiting for the right heart to make it soar. When the RAF first deployed the Mustang Mk1 in 1942, it was mostly used for reconnaissance and ground attack missions. Pilots liked its agility at low altitude but cursed its lack of power above the clouds. Few could imagine that this same airframe, properly powered, would become the long-range escort that changed the course of the air war over Europe. Across the Atlantic, American strategists faced a dilemma. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers at an unsustainable rate. Every daylight raid into Germany, from Schweinfurt to Regensburg, ended with formations shredded by German fighters. The P-47 Thunderbolt, though tough, lacked the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin. "We can't win the war if our bombers die halfway home," lamented one general in 1943. They needed a miracle, and it was sitting ignored in a factory in Inglewood, California. When British engineers suggested fitting the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that gave the Spitfire its legendary climb, everything changed. The transformation was almost alchemical. The Allison-powered workhorse became a thoroughbred. The new P-51B, born from that fusion of American engineering and British ingenuity, could climb faster, fly higher, and, most importantly, travel farther than any fighter in history. In early tests, it outran and outclimbed the FW-190. Its range, nearly 1,600 kilometers with drop tanks, meant it could finally escort B-17s all the way to Berlin and back. Suddenly, the Americans had a weapon that could reach the heart of Germany's industrial empire. But in 1943, the Luftwaffe still didn't take it seriously. German ace Adolf Galland once remarked that the Mustang is a fine little machine, but it's no danger to us at altitude. He was right, for the moment. The Allies had only a few dozen in Europe, and the Luftwaffe's aces still ruled the upper air. Yet the seeds of reversal were already planted. Back in the U.S., production lines roared to life. Factory workers, as many of them women, riveted the sleek fuselages together with precision that bordered on artistry. Each Mustang that rolled out was not just a machine, but a symbol of evolving air warfare. It wasn't built to fight over front lines. It was built to carry the war into the enemy's heart. The Germans had ignored it. The Americans almost canceled it. But the P-51's time was coming. And soon, every pilot wearing the Iron Cross would look up to see its silver wings above them. By late 1942, the first operational Mustangs had arrived in Europe under British colors. Painted with RAF markings and renamed Mustang Mark I, they flew low-level reconnaissance and fighter-bomber missions over occupied France. Their job was not glamorous. Strafing trains, ambushing convoys, photographing airfields. The P-51 was fast, rugged, and agile at treetop height, but still a stranger to the high-altitude duels that defined the war's legends. To the Germans watching from radar stations along the Channel, these intruders seemed insignificant. They were another American toy, one intelligence officer wrote, useful only for harassing farmers. Luftwaffe squadrons were busy facing Spitfires and Thunderbolts. No one expected a low-flying scout plane to change the air war. And indeed, the early Mustangs could not climb to meet the Messerschmitt Bf 109G or the new Focke-Wulf FW 190A on equal terms. Their Allison V1710 engines gasped for air above 15,000 feet, leaving the Mustangs sluggish in vertical combat. In pilot debriefings, British officers called it a marvel of design chained to the wrong heart. The RAF assigned them to Army Cooperation Command, far from the glory of the Fighter Command Elite. Yet even in this humble role, the Mustang showed glimmers of genius. Its laminar flow wing gave it extraordinary range and speed at low altitude. It could dive faster than almost anything in the sky. Reconnaissance pilots began to bring back crisp photos of targets deep inside France, proof that the aircraft could slip past radar and return home unscathed. In late 1942, during Operation Torch in North Africa, Mustangs scouted enemy positions days before Allied landings. Generals took note. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the U.S. Army Air Forces were learning a brutal lesson. Their B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, symbols of America's might, were dying in daylight. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen. Each mission cost dozens of bombers and hundreds of men. Escort fighters like the P-47 could protect them only for part of the route. Beyond that range, the bombers were alone, easy prey for the Luftwaffe's interceptors. What we need, one air commander sighed, is a fighter that can go the distance. In London, British engineers at Rolls-Royce quietly tested a solution. They removed the Mustang's Allison engine and installed their Merlin 61, the beating heart of the Spitfire Mark IX. When the prototype took off from Hucknall in October 1942, the change was immediate. The aircraft leapt from the runway, climbed like a hawk, and kept pulling. Test pilots came back grinning. This isn't the same airplane. North American engineers hurried to replicate the success in the U.S., mating the Merlin to their airframe and redesigning the cooling system. The result was the P-51B Mustang, faster than the P-47, longer ranged than the Spitfire, and elegant in motion. Still, in early 1943, the Mustang's legend was unborn. Production numbers were small and generals were cautious. The Luftwaffe command dismissed Allied reports that a new fighter was coming. Germany's air strategy was built on confidence. Their FW-190s had shredded every challenger so far. Ace pilots like Erich Hartmann and Walter Nowotny viewed the American fighters as bulky and undisciplined. The Mustang to them was just another Yankee experiment. But in the skies over Italy, the first duels began to tell a different story. U.S. pilots, now flying the P-51B, discovered they could chase German fighters at altitudes once impossible. At 25,000 feet, the Merlin roared effortlessly. In climbs and dives, the Mustang matched or exceeded the FW-190. For the first time, bombers reported seeing friendly escorts all the way to the target. Morale soared. German pilots were puzzled. After engagements, they reported a new enemy fighter, sleek, silver, unusually fast. Intelligence officers misidentified it as a variant of the British Spitfire. No one in Berlin realized that an entirely new predator had entered the ecosystem. By winter 1943, the 354th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Pioneer Mustang Group, was operational in England. Their arrival coincided with the Allies' renewed bombing offensive against the German heartland. The pilots were young, often undertrained, but they had something their predecessors lacked, an aircraft that could fly to Berlin and back without refueling. The first long-range missions shocked everyone. On the 11th of December 1943, Mustangs escorted B-17s all the way to Emden. Not a single bomber was lost to enemy fighters. One pilot wrote home, "We met them head-on and stayed until they ran out of courage." For the Luftwaffe, this was the first ripple of a storm they still refused to see. Yet in the cold air above Germany, something fundamental had shifted. The once invincible Luftwaffe was beginning to bleed. Every time they rose to meet the bombers, more of their veterans failed to return. The sky, once their empire, was becoming contested. The Mustang had drawn first blood, and no one in Berlin understood that the age of German air dominance was ending. By early 1944, the skies above Europe had become a crucible of fire. The Allied bombing campaign intensified, hammering Germany's cities, oil refineries, and factories day and night. Yet for every wave of American bombers, the Luftwaffe still waited, sharp, seasoned, and lethal. German aces like Gallant, Hartmann, and Raul continued to rack up kills, and the high command still believed their fighters could defend the Reich. What they didn't understand was that the equation had already changed. When the P-51B Mustang entered combat in numbers that winter, it was no longer a curiosity. It was a revolution. With the Packard-built Merlin engine roaring in its nose and 2 drop tanks beneath its wings, the Mustang could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back again. The Luftwaffe's defensive perimeter, once a safe ring of interception zones, was shattered. The hunters had become the hunted. For the first time, American bombers no longer flew alone into the heart of the Reich. From takeoff to target, silver-winged Mustangs circled above them, ready to dive on any German that appeared. Pilots called themselves the Little Friends. To the bomber crews who had survived Schweinfurt and Regensburg, they were guardian angels. In January 1944, the 8th Air Force struck Oschersleben and Halberstadt. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had. Over the radio, German pilots shouted warnings. Achtung! New escorts with long range! But by the time they realized what they were facing, the battle was already lost. Mustangs slashed through formations of FW-190s and BF-109s, using speed and altitude to dictate every engagement. One after another, the Luftwaffe's best men fell. They could outturn some opponents, but they couldn't outrun the Mustang. Its laminar flow wing allowed it to dive faster than anything else in the sky. Its Merlin engine kept pulling even at 30,000 feet. German pilots who tried to escape often found the silver fighter still behind them, climbing where no American plane should have been able to climb. By spring, the statistics were terrifying for Berlin. The Luftwaffe was losing dozens of aircraft a day. Training schools could not replace pilots fast enough. Fuel shortages crippled readiness. The once invincible Air Force of 1939 was being devoured by attrition, and much of that bleeding came from the Mustangs. German intelligence analysts finally began to take notice. Reports described the Langstrecken-Jäger, the long-range fighter, with exceptional maneuverability and altitude performance. But it was too late. Production bottlenecks and the Allied bombing of fuel depots ensured that even the best German fighters often couldn't take off. Meanwhile, in England, Mustang squadrons grew in strength. Units like the 357th Fighter Group and 4th Fighter Group filled the airfields of East Anglia. Their pilots painted bright noses on their aircraft, red, yellow, blue, and hunted in packs. Some became legends overnight. Major George Preddy, flying his Krieps a Mighty, downed 6 German aircraft in one day. Bud Anderson, Chuck Yeager, and countless others wrote their names into aviation history. In March 1944, the Mustangs escorted the first deep strike raids to Berlin. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had at them. Gruppen of FW-190s from JG-1 and 11, swarms of 109s from JG-26. The sky turned into a swirling chaos of contrails and tracer fire. For hours, the battle raged across northern Germany. When the bombers finally turned for home, over 300 German fighters had been destroyed. The cost to the Americans was small. A new reality settled over the Reich. The Luftwaffe could no longer control its own airspace. Factories were burning, cities lay in ruins, and every train or convoy risked being strafed by roving Mustangs. The Germans called them Luftplage, the air plague. What made the P-51 so devastating wasn't just its performance, it was its range. Unlike the Spitfire or the P-47, the Mustang could accompany bombers from start to finish, denying the Luftwaffe its old. By autumn 1944, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. The once invincible Luftwaffe, the terror of 1939 and 1940, was now a shadow of itself, bleeding to death above its own homeland. The P-51 Mustang, born as an overlooked prototype, had become the dominant predator of the air war. What began as a single design experiment had evolved into an empire of wings that stretched from Normandy to Berlin. The numbers told the story with brutal simplicity. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe could still field more than 5,000 operational fighters across Europe. By the end of that year, barely 1,200 remained combat-ready, and most were flown by boys who had never seen real combat. The veterans, those who had dueled over the Channel in Russia, were gone, consumed by endless dogfights against Mustangs and Thunderbolts. The Mustangs knew reign. When the Allies landed at Normandy in June 1944, the Mustang's long reach became decisive. P-51 squadrons swept ahead of the invasion fleet, clearing the skies of any German aircraft daring to approach. They prowled highways, rail lines, and columns of retreating armor, machine guns blazing. German soldiers began to dread the distinctive whine of the Merlin. They called the Mustangs Der Tod von oben, death from above. From their bases in England and newly captured French airfields, Mustang groups launched deep penetration raids daily. Operation Point Blank, the campaign to cripple Germany's aircraft industry, reached full fury. Plants in Regensburg, Augsburg, and Kassel were bombed repeatedly, and Mustang escorts tore apart the interceptors sent to defend them. With each lost pilot and aircraft, the Luftwaffe's ability to resist faded further. The German high command scrambled to respond. New fighters like the Messerschmitt, Me-262, the world's first operational jet, were rushed into service. On paper, it outclassed every Allied propeller plane in speed and climb rate. But paper could not fix reality. Germany lacked fuel, spare parts, and trained pilots. Allied bombing of airfields and fuel depots meant the Me-262 often couldn't even take off. When it did, squadrons of Mustangs would orbit near the runways, waiting. As soon as a jet slowed for landing, the Mustangs pounced, shredding it before its wheels touched the ground. In desperation, Hermann Göring, the once swaggering architect of Hitler's Air Force, ordered young recruits into the sky with barely 20 hours of flight time. They were brave but hopelessly outmatched. Veteran Mustang pilots like George Preddy, Don Gentile, and John Godfrey cut through them with terrifying efficiency. Air superiority had become air domination. The German collapse. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's command network was disintegrating. Radar stations were bombed, fuel convoys destroyed, and communications disrupted by Allied jamming. In December, Hitler launched his last major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, hoping fog and winter weather would ground Allied aircraft. For a few days, the skies were quiet, but when the weather cleared, the Mustangs returned like avenging spirits. They strafed roads, bridges, and columns of armor until the German advance stalled in flames. The psychological toll was immense. German soldiers wrote in diaries about living under a roof of death. Even at night, they could hear the distant hum of engines as Allied bombers passed overhead. The myth of Luftwaffe protection had evaporated. "We are naked before the sky," one Wehrmacht colonel wrote in despair. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, the Mustang had become the darling of every airman. Pilots loved its responsiveness, its stability at high speed, and its endurance. "She could take you to Berlin, win the fight, and bring you home," said Colonel Thomas Hayes. Maintenance crews admired how easily it could be serviced in the field. Commanders admired how quickly it delivered results. It was the perfect marriage of design and purpose, agile, lethal, and reliable. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively dead. The few aircraft that took off were overwhelmed by swarms of Mustangs. American bomber losses dropped dramatically, while German industrial output collapsed. The skies that once roared with the howl of FW-190s now belonged to silver-painted Mustangs escorting vast bomber formations unopposed. The final flights. In April 1945, as Allied armies closed in on Berlin, Mustang pilots flew their final missions. They hunted trains, tanks, and even boats on the rivers. Sometimes there was nothing left to shoot at. "The air felt empty," one pilot recalled, as if the war itself had run out of breath. When Germany finally surrendered, and ironically, in the early days, the Mustang had been nearly canceled by the very people it later saved. U.S. generals once saw it as an export curiosity. The Luftwaffe dismissed it as irrelevant. Yet by war's end, it was the defining machine of victory, a weapon that had not only fought the enemy but rewritten the very meaning of air power. The price of supremacy. But triumph came with grief. More than 2,500 Mustang pilots were killed or went missing during the war. Many never returned from the frozen skies of Germany. The survivors carried memories of fire and smoke, of friends who vanished in seconds. Yet they also carried a quiet pride. They knew they had been part of something historic, a transformation of warfare from endurance to dominance. As the war ended, Allied leaders paid tribute to the aircraft that had made it possible. General Karl Spaatz declared, "Without the Mustang, we might not have won the air war over Europe." Even the enemy acknowledged it. Galland, the Luftwaffe ace, said later, "The Mustang was the best all-around fighter of the war. It was the aircraft we feared most." From underestimation to undisputed mastery, the P-51's story was complete. The Germans had ignored it. Now they looked up at the contrails above their ruined cities and saw the symbol of their defeat. The Mustang had not merely dominated the skies, it had conquered the myth of German invincibility. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, the once feared Luftwaffe lay in ruins, and the P-51 Mustang reigned unchallenged. Across Allied airfields from England to France, silver aircraft stood in perfect rows, engines cooling, wings streaked with oil and victory. Pilots who had lived through the furnace of aerial war leaned against their machines, aware that they had flown the finest piston engine fighter ever built. But history rarely lets legends rest. The war was over, yet the Mustang's journey had only begun. From warrior to guardian. In the chaotic aftermath of World War II, thousands of Mustangs were parked, sold, or scrapped. Some were shipped home in crates. Others sat quietly in European fields, waiting for orders that never came. The U.S. Army Air Forces, soon to become the United States Air Force, turned its gaze toward the jet age. New machines, the P-80 Shooting Star and F-86 Sabre, promised the future. Many officers believed propeller-driven fighters were obsolete, yet reality had a way of proving otherwise. The world still needed reliable, long-range aircraft, and the P-51 fit that need perfectly. It became the first-line interceptor of dozens of nations: Sweden, Israel, the Netherlands, Australia, and even post-war Japan. Wherever it flew, it carried an aura, the ghost of victory over Europe. Meanwhile, in America, the Mustang's legend began to crystallize in the public imagination. Air shows, films, and newsreels celebrated it as the plane that won the war. Veterans remembered its growl, its grace, and its gift of survival. Children built models of it. Mechanics restored it. Hollywood immortalized it. The P-51 had transcended its steel and rivets. It had become a symbol. The Korean rebirth. Then came Korea. When North Korean forces swept across the 38th parallel in June 1950, the newly formed U.S. Air Force faced an urgent crisis. Its shiny jet fighters were fast but few, and they required long, smooth runways, luxuries the rough Korean peninsula did not offer. The answer came from dusty hangars where the old Mustangs had been sleeping. Rechristened the F-51D, the Mustang returned to war. Once again, its range and durability made it indispensable. Flying from crude airstrips, it carried bombs, rockets, and napalm against advancing North Korean armor. Pilots praised its precision and loiter time. Troops on the ground called its low-flying attacks "angels of mercy." The irony was striking. In an age of jets, it was a propeller-driven veteran of the 1940s that once again shaped the battlefield. Even as MiG-15s slashed through the upper altitudes, the Mustang ruled the valleys, rivers, and mountains where ground forces fought. It remained deadly, versatile, and beloved. For many pilots, Korea was a farewell performance, the Mustang's last great symphony of war. When the conflict stabilized and jets took full control, the F-51 was finally retired from frontline service. But its legend, tempered by 2 wars, had grown into something larger than life. A global icon. In the decades that followed, the Mustang found new roles in smaller nations and civilian life. It became a race, perhaps most remarkably, the P-51 never lost its relevance in hearts and minds. At air bases and museums, veterans would place a hand on its cool metal and feel time collapse. The noise of flak, the smell of oil, the thrill of seeing home again after Berlin. Younger generations raised in an age of drones and stealth jets still look up at the Mustang's silhouette and recognize something eternal. Courage made visible. Legacy of innovation. Technically, the P-51 was the bridge between eras. It marked the culmination of piston engine design, aerodynamic efficiency, range, power, and laid the groundwork for everything that followed. The concept of air superiority through reach, of controlling not just the sky but the distance itself, began with the Mustang. Every modern long-range fighter from the F-15 to the F-35 traces its lineage to that philosophy. Its marriage of American engineering and British innovation, the laminar flow wing and the Merlin engine, became a model of international collaboration. In that sense, the P-51 was not just a weapon, it was an idea that cooperation and ingenuity could overcome arrogance and empire. The final flight. Today, fewer than 300 Mustangs remain airworthy. Yet each time one starts its Merlin, a sound echoes across decades. The deep, rolling growl that once terrified Luftwaffe pilots and inspired bomber crews. The smell of burning aviation fuel mixes with nostalgia. Spectators raise cameras, children cover their ears, and veterans smile through tears. From the fields of Normandy to the valleys of Korea, from forgotten factories to museums gleaming with chrome, the Mustang endures. It is a machine that transcended war, a symbol of precision and resilience. In 1942, Germany dismissed it as a low-altitude curiosity. In 1945, it ruled their skies. In 2025, it still flies. The P-51 Mustang was more than a fighter. It was a statement of what technology, courage, and vision can achieve when they meet at the edge of history. The Luftwaffe once owned the heavens. But the Mustang taught the world a lesson that still holds true today. Never underestimate the quiet machines. They may yet change the world.